Today, we will learn how to really snipe scalp any asset. We will learn how to analyze low and high time frames. In the next part, I'll show you how to determine your gameplay zones before scalping. We will also do a quick introduction to the liquidity hunt, also known as stop-loss hunting. Finally, I'll show you my recent trades. If you're ready, let's start. We are about to complete 20-25% of our free price action trading course. Today we will cover the breakers and scalping methods. If you are looking for a structured table of contents, you can find it on Google Drive or directly from my website, which is in the description. I suggest you to watch videos in order, otherwise it can be confusing. Let's start with the high time frame analysis. Let's check out the 4 hours time frame. If you are so confused about time frames, start combining 4 hours, 1 hour, 15 minutes, and 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 minutes together for a starter. As you can see here, we are in an uptrend. However, if you check the daily time frame and global consensus, you will understand the general feeling is a bear market and quite weak. Now, if you draw your premium and discount zones, you can clearly see where to go long or short. I took like 20-25 trades in the last 30 days because the market structure was so clear with premium and discount zones. Let's get closer to the latest price action. When you draw your breakout, premium and discount zones, you may notice the weakness of breakouts. It just keeps leaving long wicks. Price keep being rejected from this price level. What I see here low quality breaks and partially swing failure patterns. What does it mean? This is a general area for the stop loss hunt and greed stage. The only reason for that is these weak breaks and considerable swing failure patterns. However, if the price breakout was high quality and really strong with long green candlestick, my idea would be different. Let's open 1 hour time frame and get a closer look to identify a better price action. First of all, I want you to tell me, where are the swing failure patterns in this chart? Pause the video. Yes, exactly. There are 3 swing failure patterns here in a row. All of them are real swing failure patterns. What does it mean? It is an extreme price weakness, a possible reversal of a major trend. Your second question should always be this: where this price can move? Is there a reason to go down? Anything that pulls the price down. You can see the equal lows and imbalance right here, the deadliest target combo. Then my final question is, where can I enter a trade? How can I scalp this price range? How to achieve sniper scalping? You can see the giant imbalance here, right after the high quality break. Moreover, the downtrend area. People ask me about liquidity. I will cover all liquidity concepts in the second phase of the course, do not worry. However, I will do a quick intro today soon, only for you. So what I do is here determine my gameplay zone. This is the place that I'm gonna scalp in low time frames. This is real scalping, guys. First, you determine your gameplay area from the high time frames. Then you open your low time frames to scalp the chart. Now, let's have a quick intro to liquidity and stop loss hunting. What is social media teaching you? First, tell me that. They say open 1 minute, 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes charts and start scalping. This is what the mainstream media teaches you. They teach you to scalp the low time frames without looking at any high time frames. Can you see the obvious downtrend here with this 3 minutes chart? Yes. How do new traders use this chart to open a position? From the trend resistance, right? Not bad at all. As you can see, early traders are in profit, and the late traders are in partial profit. The biggest problem of new traders, they do not take profits. Again, the mainstream media keeps teaching them to be rich, how to become a rich in one day. So beginners have no sense of taking profits. This above area is the liquidity pool, basically where the stop loss orders are waiting. There are tens of thousands of orders here. You cannot even imagine how many orders there are because there are millions of scalp traders out there. And 80% to 90% of them keep losing money. They have no idea about how to scalp at all. Let's zoom out the chart and open the 15 minutes time frame, which new traders never even look at. First of all, you can notice the high quality break right here. And then the imbalance, which I love. I am one step ahead of beginner scalpers because I checked the low and high time frames together. How did I take my trade? I waited for all the stop losses to be hunted here in this chart. Those beginner scalpers had no idea about high time frames. I knew that very well. As you can see, the liquidity is stop loss hunting, but nothing else. It's a quite simple concept. However, it really takes time to master. I will fully cover it in the second part of the course after I finish the foundations. Subscribe if you wait for it. Okay, let's check the 15 minutes chart again. Before opening the low time frames for sniper scalping, once I saw this downtrend liquidity hunt and all the stop losses of new scalper traders were taken out, I waited for the price to touch this 15 minutes imbalance. I took my first trade right after here. I did real sniper trading. Let's open low time frames and understand how to keep scalping the low time frames in this gameplay zone. Yes, the gameplay zone. If you want to be a scalper, you must determine the gameplay zone with high time frames first. I already covered the gameplay zone fully in one of my videos. It is simply the area between possible entry and target points from the high time frames, such as imbalance to imbalance, or order blocks to order block, or imbalance to equal lows or highs. Okay, let's check the significant area and learn how to scalp. When the 15 minutes imbalance tapped, I waited for a market structure break with a 1 minute chart. There were a couple of breaks, but not real and strong market structure break. My other entry style is always reverse optimal trade entry, ROTE. However, this is a much riskier entry type than MSB in low time frames. If you look at the chart closely, you can see the double swing failure pattern, the weakness of the trend, and notice the reverse optimal trade entry pattern. What about the target? Yet again, equal low and imbalance combinations. I held the trade much longer because of the gameplay area and other targets from the high time frames. Let's check the 5 minutes chart and look at the other scalping opportunities in the gameplay zone. First of all, you can notice the kind of SR flip area here after a sharp drop and break. Price never pulls back above, which could have been better for us. However, as I said before, if you miss the MSB, then wait for the early break of structures. You can see an early break of structure here. Price pulls back to the premium zone and drops again. Then another one, another opportunity, scalp the area. Then another one, price breaks and pullbacks to the premium and fills the imbalance. However, the last one could have been a fake. It was touching the imbalance from the high time frames. But there was so much liquidity below, price was put to that zone eventually. Okay folks, this is how you really scalp. This is the real sniper scalping strategy that you must use if you really care about your money. I hope this was another valuable video session to improve yourself. It requires regular practice and patience. I hope you subscribe to the channel and like the video. Help me to reach new traders to teach the right trading methods. Thank you, take care, and see you soon.